The sound of metal clicking against metal echoed through Lenox Lounge at 11:47 p.m. on September 12, 1958. Big Sam's massive hands were trembling as he stared down at the empty chamber of his .38 Special, the weapon he had planned to use to execute his closest friend for $50,000. The silence in that smoky Harlem nightclub was deafening. Every patron, every bartender, every musician had frozen in place as they witnessed what should have been the assassination of the most powerful man in Harlem. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't dead. Instead, he was slowly turning around in his leather chair, his cold eyes meeting those of the man who had just tried to kill him, and the words that came out of his mouth would echo through the streets of New York for decades to come. What nobody in that room understood, what the history books would never capture, was that this moment had been orchestrated 3 weeks earlier. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just survived an assassination attempt. He had engineered it. The man they called the Godfather of Harlem had turned what should have been his execution into the most brilliant psychological warfare campaign the underworld had ever seen. But to understand the genius of what happened that night, you need to understand the war that had been raging in the shadows of New York City for almost 5 years. By 1958, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to everyone as Bumpy, wasn't just another street criminal. He was the undisputed king of Harlem, controlling a numbers empire that generated more money than most legitimate businesses. But his power went far beyond gambling. Bumpy Johnson had become something the Italian mob families couldn't comprehend, a criminal leader who ruled through genuine respect and community investment rather than pure intimidation. When elderly black women couldn't afford their rent, Bumpy paid it anonymously. When corrupt white police officers harassed local business owners, Bumpy made phone calls that ended the harassment permanently. When young black men faced unfair prison sentences, Bumpy's lawyers appeared in court, often securing acquittals or reduced charges. This wasn't charity. This was strategy. Every favor Bumpy performed, every injustice he corrected, every family he helped created a network of loyalty that made him virtually untouchable. The Italian families understood fear and greed, but they couldn't penetrate a power structure built on genuine community bonds. This fundamental misunderstanding would prove to be their greatest weakness and ultimately lead to their most spectacular failure. The 5 families had tried everything to break Bumpy's hold on Harlem. They sent enforcers to intimidate his numbers runners, only to find those same enforcers beaten unconscious and dumped on the steps of police stations with notes pinned to their chests reading, "Return to sender." They attempted to bribe local politicians to change gambling laws, but Bumpy's political connections ran deeper than theirs, extending all the way to City Hall and beyond. They tried direct negotiation, offering Bumpy partnerships and percentages, but he refused every overture with a simple message: Harlem belonged to Harlem, not to downtown Italians who had never walked its streets or understood its people. Frank Costello, the most sophisticated and dangerous of the mob bosses, recognized that conventional tactics were useless against Bumpy Johnson. During a clandestine meeting at a private club in Manhattan's Little Italy, Costello presented his analysis to representatives of all 5 families. The Genovese family sent Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno. The Gambinos were represented by Carlo Gambino himself. The Lucchese family sent Tommy Lucchese. The Bonanno family had sent Joe Magliocco, and the Colombo family was represented by Joseph Colombo Sr. Costello spread photographs of Bumpy across the mahogany table, images taken by private investigators over months of surveillance. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades in organized crime, "we're dealing with something unprecedented. This isn't a traditional criminal organization. Bumpy Johnson has created a hybrid between a criminal enterprise and a social movement. His power doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from genuine loyalty, and that makes him exponentially more dangerous than any enemy we've ever faced." Carlo Gambino, methodically cutting the end of an expensive Cuban cigar, looked up from the photographs. "So what do you propose, Frank? We've thrown money at this problem. We've sent our best soldiers. We've tried political pressure. Nothing works." Costello leaned back in his leather chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We stopped trying to fight the organization and start targeting the man. But not with bullets or bombs. Those approaches have failed because they're expected. Bumpy Johnson has survived attempts on his life before. He's prepared for external threats. But every powerful man has one vulnerability: the people closest to him. This was when the conversation turned to Samuel Foster, known throughout Harlem as Big Sam. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing 260 pounds of solid muscle, Sam had been Bumpy's bodyguard and closest confidant since 1953. He had taken bullets intended for Bumpy on 2 separate occasions. He knew every detail of Bumpy's operation, every safe house location, every contact, every routine. More importantly, he was one of the few people Bumpy trusted completely. The family's research into Sam's background revealed several potential pressure points. He had a younger sister living in Chicago who worked as a nurse and supported 3 children as a single mother. He had gambling debts that, while manageable, represented a constant source of stress. Most significantly, he had been passed over for a promotion within Bumpy's organization 6 months earlier, a decision that had reportedly caused some private resentment. Tommy Lucchese, known for his ability to flip supposedly loyal associates, took the lead on the Sam Foster project. Rather than approaching Sam directly, which would have been too risky and obvious, Lucchese's people spent weeks studying Sam's routines, his favorite bars, his personal relationships, his psychological profile. They discovered that Sam frequented a jazz club in Queens on Tuesday nights, often drinking alone while listening to live music. The approach, when it came, was masterful in its subtlety. A well-dressed man named Vincent Torino, claiming to be a booking agent for musicians, struck up conversations with Sam over several weeks. Torino never mentioned Bumpy Johnson or criminal activities. Instead, he talked about music, about life in New York, about the challenges facing black professionals in a white-dominated society. He bought Sam drinks, shared stories about his own supposed struggles, and gradually built what appeared to be a genuine friendship. Only after 6 weeks of careful relationship building did Torino begin introducing more sensitive topics. He mentioned meeting some Italian businessmen who had expressed interest in establishing legitimate partnerships with successful black entrepreneurs. He spoke about opportunities for people with the right connections to earn substantial money through completely legal ventures. He never explicitly mentioned betraying Bumpy, never used threatening language, never revealed his true identity or connections. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and patient. Torino played on Sam's unacknowledged resentments, his financial concerns, his desire for respect and independence. He painted pictures of a future where Sam could step out of Bumpy's shadow and become a successful businessman in his own right. The $50,000 figure wasn't presented as payment for murder but as an initial investment in Sam's future legitimate business ventures, money that would be made available after he provided certain information about Bumpy's operations. Sam's decision to accept the contract wasn't made in a single moment of weakness. It was the result of months of careful psychological conditioning, subtle manipulation, and gradual erosion of his loyalty to Bumpy. By the time he agreed to participate in what he believed would be a simple information-gathering operation that might result in Bumpy's arrest rather than his death, Sam had been thoroughly compromised without fully realizing it. But what the 5 families didn't know, what their sophisticated intelligence networks had failed to detect, was that Bumpy Johnson had been aware of their recruitment efforts almost from the beginning. Bumpy's own network of informants included people working in the very establishments where Torino had approached Sam. More importantly, Bumpy understood his own people better than any outsider ever could. He knew Sam's psychological vulnerabilities, his financial pressures, his personal resentments. He had been watching for signs of potential betrayal long before the Italians began their recruitment campaign. The brilliance of Bumpy's response lay not in preventing Sam's betrayal but in controlling it. Rather than confronting Sam directly or eliminating him quietly, Bumpy decided to use the situation to send a message that would end the 5 families' interest in Harlem permanently. He began feeding Sam carefully selected pieces of false information, creating the impression that he was becoming careless with operational security while actually providing misleading intelligence that would serve his own purposes. Bumpy's plan required extraordinary self-control and strategic thinking. He had to continue treating Sam as a trusted associate, while knowing that Sam was reporting his movements to enemies who wanted him dead. He had to appear vulnerable while actually maintaining complete control over the situation. Most challengingly, he had to engineer circumstances that would expose the betrayal publicly and dramatically enough to destroy any future attempts at infiltrating his organization. The weapon Sam carried into Lenox Lounge that night had been carefully prepared by Bumpy's people. The firing pin had been filed down just enough to prevent the gun from discharging while leaving it visually and tactily identical to a functional weapon. Sam's approach route, the timing of his arrival, even his positioning in the lounge had all been subtly orchestrated through seemingly casual suggestions made over previous weeks. When Sam pulled the trigger and heard only the metallic click of a firing pin striking an empty chamber, the psychological impact was devastating. In that moment, he realized not only that his assassination attempt had failed but that Bumpy had known about it all along. The implication was clear. Bumpy Johnson was so far ahead of his enemies that he could predict their moves, manipulate their agents, and turn their own weapons against them. The 5 words Bumpy spoke as he turned to face his would-be assassin carried multiple layers of meaning that resonated throughout the criminal underworld. "I've been counting on you," simultaneously acknowledged Sam's betrayal, revealed Bumpy's foreknowledge of the plot, and demonstrated his complete control over the situation. But the phrase also contained a deeper message. Bumpy had been counting on Sam to provide the opportunity for this public demonstration of his power and intelligence. The psychological warfare implications of this moment extended far beyond the immediate situation. Every criminal in New York, whether allied with Bumpy or opposed to him, learned a crucial lesson that night. Bumpy Johnson couldn't just outfight his enemies, he could outthink them. He could predict their strategies, manipulate their agents, and turn their own plots into demonstrations of his superiority. This reputation for almost supernatural awareness and control would prove more valuable than any number of armed bodyguards or fortified locations. The immediate aftermath of the failed assassination attempt was carefully choreographed to maximize its psychological impact. Rather than killing Sam immediately, which would have been the expected response, Bumpy ordered him to sit down at the table. For the next hour, with the entire lounge watching in fascinated silence, Bumpy calmly explained exactly how the recruitment process had worked, detailing Torino's approach, the gradual manipulation, and the false promises that had convinced Sam to betray his closest friend. This public dissection of the 5 families' operation served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Bumpy's intelligence network was sophisticated enough to monitor and counter enemy recruitment efforts. It revealed the methods and vulnerabilities the Italians relied upon, making similar future operations nearly impossible. Most importantly, it showed everyone present that betraying Bumpy Johnson didn't just risk death, it risked public humiliation and the complete exposure of one's weakness and gullibility. The story of what happened at Lenox Lounge that night spread through Harlem and beyond with the speed and power of legend. Details became embellished in the telling, but the core message remained consistent. Bumpy Johnson was so intelligent, so well-informed, and so strategically sophisticated that he could turn even assassination attempts into demonstrations of his power. This reputation proved invaluable in the months and years that followed. Within 2 weeks of the failed assassination, Vincent Torino's body was found in the trunk of a car parked outside Frank Costello's private club. The message was unmistakable. Bumpy's intelligence network could reach anyone, anywhere, including the most protected assets of the 5 families. The psychological pressure on the Italian mob families was intense and unrelenting. Frank Costello, recognized as the most intelligent and strategic of the mob bosses, called for a complete cessation of activities against Bumpy Johnson. During a private meeting with his closest associates, Costello reportedly said, "We're not fighting a street criminal. We're fighting someone who thinks like us but knows his territory better than we know ours. This war is unwinnable, and continuing it will only cost us more money, more men, and more reputation." The other families initially resisted Costello's assessment, but subsequent events proved his wisdom. Every attempt to establish operations in Harlem was immediately detected and countered. Informants within the Italian organizations began feeding information to Bumpy's people. Several high-level family members found their personal information, including details about their families, their finances, and their legal vulnerabilities, circulated anonymously to law enforcement agencies. The campaign of psychological warfare that began with the failed assassination at Lenox Lounge escalated into a systematic dismantling of the five families' intelligence capabilities and operational security in New York. Bumpy Johnson had transformed a defensive operation into an offensive campaign that left his enemies demoralized, paranoid, and increasingly unwilling to continue their attempts to control Harlem. But perhaps the most profound impact of that night was on Bumpy Johnson himself. The successful manipulation of such a complex and dangerous situation confirmed his evolution from street criminal to strategic mastermind. He had demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and psychological insight could be more powerful than violence or intimidation. This realization would influence his approach to power and conflict for the rest of his career. The fate of Big Sam became part of the legend surrounding that night. Rather than executing him immediately, Bumpy made a decision that surprised everyone who knew his reputation for swift and brutal justice. He banished Sam from Harlem with a warning that returning would mean death, but he also provided him with enough money to start over somewhere else. This act of mercy, coming after such a profound betrayal, enhanced Bumpy's reputation for unpredictability and psychological complexity. Years later, criminal historians and sociologists would study the events at Lenox Lounge as a masterpiece of psychological warfare and strategic planning. The transformation of an assassination attempt into a demonstration of intellectual superiority represented a level of criminal sophistication that hadn't been seen before in American organized crime. Bumpy Johnson had proven that the most powerful weapon in the criminal underworld wasn't a gun or a bomb, but a superior understanding of human psychology and the patience to use that understanding strategically. The ripple effects of that September night continued for decades. The five families never again attempted to establish significant operations in Harlem during Bumpy's lifetime. The story became part of criminal folklore, inspiring countless imitators and establishing new standards for intelligence operations within organized crime. Most importantly, it secured Bumpy Johnson's position as the undisputed ruler of Harlem until his death in 1968, ensuring that the community he had fought to protect remained under the control of someone who understood its needs and respected its people. The legacy of those 5 words spoken in Lenox Lounge, "I've been counting on you," became a reminder that in the world of organized crime, as in warfare and politics, the greatest victories often belong not to the strongest or the most ruthless, but to those who can think furthest ahead and understand their enemies better than their enemies understand themselves. The psychological warfare that Bumpy Johnson employed that night represented just one facet of a much more complex criminal empire that he had been methodically constructing throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. What made his approach truly revolutionary was how he understood that sustainable power in Harlem required more than just street credibility or violent intimidation. It demanded a sophisticated understanding of community dynamics, economic flows, and the delicate balance between legitimate business and criminal enterprise. In the months following the Lenox Lounge incident, Bumpy began implementing what could only be described as a parallel governance system within Harlem. While the official city government provided basic services and legal framework, Bumpy's organization filled the gaps that traditional institutions couldn't or wouldn't address. His network of informants wasn't just limited to criminals and hustlers. It included shop owners, taxi drivers, beauticians, bartenders, and even some clergy members who understood that Bumpy's protection often meant the difference between a thriving business and one that fell victim to random violence or systematic exploitation. This intelligence network functioned with remarkable efficiency because it was built on genuine mutual benefit rather than pure coercion. When Mrs. Henderson's grocery store on 125th Street was being shaken down by young thugs who didn't understand the established order, a quiet word from one of Bumpy's associates would resolve the situation permanently. When the Williams family couldn't afford their rent after the father lost his job at the dock, they might find an envelope slipped under their door with just enough money to get by, along with information about a job opening that matched the father's skills. These weren't acts of charity. They were investments in a community-wide system of loyalty and obligation that made Bumpy's rule more stable than any amount of fear could achieve. The economic sophistication of Bumpy's operations also set him apart from typical street-level criminals. While other operators focused primarily on numbers running, drug dealing, or protection rackets, Bumpy understood the importance of legitimate business fronts and community economic development. He had interests in several barbershops, restaurants, and small retail establishments throughout Harlem. These businesses served multiple purposes. They provided cover for money laundering operations, created legitimate employment opportunities for community members, and established gathering places where information could be collected and disseminated. One of his most ingenious arrangements involved a partnership with several legitimate businessmen who needed capital but couldn't access traditional banking services due to racial discrimination. Bumpy would provide loans at reasonable interest rates, secured not just by collateral but by the borrower's integration into his information network. A restaurant owner who received funding to expand might be expected to report on conversations overheard from customers who worked in city government or law enforcement. A taxi company that received financial backing would ensure that drivers remained alert for information about rival criminal activities or police operations. This approach created a web of interconnected obligations and benefits that made it nearly impossible for outside organizations to gain a foothold in Harlem without Bumpy's knowledge and consent. When the Colombo family made their first tentative attempts to establish bookmaking operations in the neighborhood in late 1962, Bumpy knew about their meetings before they had even selected their first local recruits. The information came from a barber whose shop they had visited, a taxi driver who had overheard their conversations, and a restaurant owner who had noticed their pattern of meetings over expensive meals they paid for with suspiciously large bills. Rather than respond with immediate violence, Bumpy chose to demonstrate the futility of their efforts through a carefully orchestrated campaign of inconvenience. The Colombo representatives found that their cars developed mechanical problems with suspicious regularity. Restaurant reservations they had made were mysteriously cancelled. Hotel rooms they had booked became unavailable due to plumbing issues, or double bookings. Phone calls went unreturned, and meetings with potential associates were repeatedly postponed or moved to locations that turned out to be under police surveillance. The message was clear without a single threat being made explicitly. Harlem was not available for outside exploitation, and any attempt to establish operations there would face constant, insurmountable obstacles. After 6 weeks of frustration, the Colombo representatives abandoned their expansion plans and focused their attention on more receptive territories in Brooklyn and Queens. This pattern of defensive action became Bumpy's signature approach to territorial disputes. He understood that outright warfare was costly, unpredictable, and attracted unwanted police attention. By contrast, systematic disruption of enemy operations was sustainable, deniable, and often more effective than violence in discouraging future incursions. It also reinforced his reputation as someone who was always several steps ahead of his opponents, capable of anticipating their moves and countering them before they could gain momentum. The respect this approach earned him extended far beyond the criminal community. Police detectives who had spent years trying to build cases against Bumpy found themselves grudgingly admiring his methods, even as they worked to undermine his operations. Detective Lieutenant Frank Morrison, who led the NYPD's organized crime unit in Harlem throughout the 1960s, later admitted in his memoirs that Bumpy Johnson was the most intelligent criminal I ever encountered, and possibly the most principled. Morrison noted that during Bumpy's reign, violent crime rates in central Harlem were significantly lower than in comparable neighborhoods, and that many residents genuinely felt safer under his informal protection than they did relying solely on official law enforcement. This paradox highlighted one of the most complex aspects of Bumpy's legacy. While he was undeniably a criminal who profited from illegal activities, his methods of operation often served community interests more effectively than legitimate institutions. His dispute resolution mechanisms were faster and more decisive than the court system. His economic development initiatives provided opportunities that mainstream banks and businesses were unwilling to offer to African American entrepreneurs. His security arrangements protected residents from random violence more reliably than overwhelmed and sometimes indifferent police patrols. The moral ambiguity of this situation wasn't lost on Bumpy himself. In private conversations with close associates, he sometimes reflected on the contradictions inherent in his position. He understood that his criminal activities caused real harm, particularly through drug trafficking, but he also recognized that the alternative to his control was often chaos that would cause even greater suffering. He saw himself as a temporary solution to systemic problems that society was unwilling or unable to address through legitimate means. This self-awareness influenced his long-term planning in ways that distinguished him from most criminal leaders. Rather than focusing solely on maximizing immediate profits, Bumpy invested considerable time and resources in identifying and developing potential successors who could maintain his organizational structure and community relationships. He established educational funds for promising young people in the neighborhood, reasoning that some of them might eventually provide legitimate leadership that could replace the need for criminal governance. He also maintained careful boundaries around his most destructive activities. While he profited from drug trafficking, he prohibited sales to minors and established severe penalties for dealers who violated this rule. He refused to allow prostitution operations in residential areas where families lived, confining such activities to commercial districts where they were less visible to the broader community. These limitations cost him significant potential revenue, but they preserved the community support that was essential to his long-term survival. The sustainability of Bumpy's approach was tested repeatedly throughout the turbulent decade of the 1960s, as civil rights activism, urban renewal projects, and changing drug markets created new challenges and opportunities. His ability to adapt to these changes while maintaining his core principles and methods demonstrated the fundamental soundness of his strategic approach and ensured that his influence would persist long after his death in 1968, continuing to shape Harlem's development for generations to come. His legacy became particularly evident in how Harlem's power structures evolved after his passing. The vacuum left by Johnson's death was not filled by a single successor, but rather by a network of smaller operators who had learned from his methods. Many of these individuals had worked directly under his guidance, absorbing his lessons about the importance of community integration and the dangers of excessive violence. They understood that Bumpy's longevity came not from his willingness to use force, but from his restraint in applying it and his commitment to serving broader community interests alongside his own criminal enterprises. The educational initiatives that Johnson had quietly supported continued to bear fruit in the years following his death. Several young people who had benefited from his scholarships and mentorship programs went on to become influential community leaders, business owners, and even politicians. These individuals carried forward his understanding that real power in Harlem required legitimacy beyond mere criminal control, and that sustainable influence demanded genuine investment in the community's long-term welfare and development prospects. Johnson's influence on the cultural landscape of Harlem also proved remarkably durable. The jazz clubs and entertainment venues that had operated under his protection during the 1950s and 1960s became legendary institutions that helped define Harlem's identity as a center of African American culture and artistic expression. His understanding that culture and entertainment could serve as both economic engines and sources of community pride had created a foundation that supported Harlem's emergence as a globally recognized cultural destination, attracting visitors and investment that benefited the entire neighborhood for decades to come.